Leviticus chapter 13. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man has a scar on the surface of his skin or a shiny spot, and it appears to be a leprous infection, he is to be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests. The priest shall examine the infection on the surface of his skin, and if the hair in the infection is turned white, and the infection appears deeper than the surface of the skin, it is a leprous infection. Thus the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if the shiny spot on the surface of his skin is white, but appears to be no more than skin deep, and its hair has not turned white, but it's dark, the priest shall quarantine him for 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and indeed, if the infection appears as it was, and is not spread on the skin, the priest shall quarantine him another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day, and indeed, if the infection is dark, and is not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a spot, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the spot happens to spread at all on the skin, after he was seen by the priest for his cleansing, then he must be seen by the priest again. So if the priest sees the spot has indeed spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. When the leprous infection is on a man, he shall be brought to the priest. The priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the scar on the skin is white, and has turned the hair white, and some of the flesh in the scar is healthy and alive, it is an old leprosy on the surface of his skin. The priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall quarantine him, for he is unclean. But if leprosy breaks out all over the skin, and it covers from head to foot all the skin of the one with the infection, according to the full examination of the priest, then the priest shall consider, and indeed, if the leprosy covers the entire surface of his skin, he shall pronounce clean him who has the infection, because it all turned white. He is clean. But in whatever day an open wound appears on him, he shall be unclean. Thus the priest shall examine the open wound and pronounce him unclean. For an open wound is unclean, it is leprosy. But if the surface of the skin is restored and turns white again, he shall come to the priest. The priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the infection has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him clean who has the infection. He is clean. If one's body develops an ulcer in the skin and it is healed, and in the place of the ulcer there comes a white scar or a shiny or inflamed spot, it shall be known to the priest. When the priest sees it, and indeed it appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy which broke out in the ulcer. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there is no white hair in it, and it is not deeper than the skin surface, but it's dark, the priest shall quarantine him 7 days. But if it should spread over the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection which broke out in the ulcer. But if the shiny spot stays in one place and has not spread, it is the scar of the ulcer, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or if one's body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the open wound of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, the priest shall examine it, and indeed, if the hair of the bright spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy, broken out in the burn. Therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in the bright spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but is dark, then the priest shall quarantine him 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. If it has at all spread over the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection broken out in the ulcer. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread on the skin, but is dark, it is a scar from the burn. The priest shall pronounce him clean. If a man or woman appears to have a leprous infection on the head or the beard, the priest shall examine the infection, and indeed, if it appears deeper than the skin, and there is thin yellow hair on it, The priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a lesion, a leprosy of the head or beard. But if the priest examines the infection of the lesion, and indeed it does not appear deeper than the skin, and there is no thin yellow hair in it, the priest shall quarantine 7 days the one who has the infection of the lesion. Then on the 7th day the priest shall examine the infection, and indeed if the lesion is not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and the indentation does not appear deeper than the skin, he shall shave himself, but he shall not shave the lesion. Then the priest shall quarantine another 7 days the one who has the lesion. On the 7th day the priest shall examine the lesion, and indeed, if the lesion has not spread over the skin, and the indentation does not appear deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. He shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the lesion appears to spread at all on the skin after his cleansing, the priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the lesion has spread over the skin, the priest need not seek for yellow hair. He is unclean. But if the lesion appears to be at a standstill, and there is black hair grown up in it, the lesion has healed. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. If a man or woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, specifically shining white spots, the priest shall look, and indeed, if the bright spots on the skin of the body are shining white spots, it is eczema. He is clean. As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald on the forehead, but he is clean. Now, if there is on the bald head or bald forehead a reddish-white infection, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the infection of the reddish-white skin on his bald head or on his bald forehead is like the form of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His infection is on his head. Now the clothes of the leper on whom the infection is shall be torn, and his head uncovered, and he shall cover his mouth, and he shall be called unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the infection, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell apart. His way of life shall be outside the camp. Also, if a garment has a leprous infection in it, whether it is a woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it is in the warp or woof of linen or wool, whether in leather or in anything made of leather, and if the infection is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather, whether in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, then it is a leprous infection, and shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the infection and quarantine him who has the infection 7 days. Then he shall examine the infection on the 7th day. If the infection has spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, in the leather, or in anything made of leather, the infection is an active leprosy. It is unclean. Therefore he shall burn the garment with the infection, whether the warp or woof in wool or linen, or in anything of leather, for it is an active leprosy. The garment shall be burned in the fire. But if the priest examines it, and indeed the infection has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, then the priest shall order that the object with the infection be washed, and he shall quarantine it another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine the infection after it is washed. And indeed, if the infection has not changed its color, though the infection has not spread, it is unclean. It shall be burned in the fire, for it's firmly established in the garment, either in the warp or the woof. If the priest examines it, and indeed the infection is dark after washing it, he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp or the woof or the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or the woof, or in anything made of leather, it is a spreading leprosy, and that garment with the infection shall be burned with fire. But if you wash the garment, either warp or woof, of anything made of leather, and the infection disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time, and shall be clean. This is the law of the leprous infection in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or woof, or in anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean.